We are live. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another edition of my weekly radio or internet talk show, Legal Ease, with attorney Chris DeBerry, where we discuss legal topics, matters to do with insurance, and things that are important to consumers and to people that have been involved in motor vehicle accidents who have otherwise been hurt because of the negligence or carelessness of others. And today we're going to talk about something extremely important, and that is the do's and don'ts of purchasing automobile insurance. And I have with me as my guest, Craig Most. Craig Most is got over 18 years of experience in the insurance industry. He comes from a military background, formerly with the United States Army, and has been an agent with Most Insurance for nearly 2 decades. And I can't imagine anybody that I would rather have explain to you the ins and outs and the do's and don'ts of purchasing this very, very important type of coverage, or this bundle of coverages, really, because an auto policy is pretty involved and it involves many different types of coverages and dynamics. But Craig, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Chris. Always a pleasure to be able to talk with you and share a little bit of education. So hopefully people don't make the mistakes that others before them did and find out after the fact they wish they knew more and therefore could have done more before they need their auto insurance to come into play.
Absolutely. And this is actually your second time presenting with us, and we're really happy to have you back.
Well,
And the last time we got into educating people as to the types of coverage that exist potentially under a policy. But now today we're going to talk a little bit about what you're going to need and what to avoid when shopping for insurance. And I have my insurance through Most Insurance, and I've been subject to your process, your intake and insuring process, and I'm very, very happy with everything you guys have done for me and for my family and business. And I would encourage people to contact you at Most Insurance with any questions that they might have. But let's get into it now. So you're purchasing auto insurance, and the way I'm going to put the question to you is you go into a carrier and you ask to purchase a policy that's going to give you all the coverages that you need to protect yourself. So you want to be fully covered. And how do you recommend a person approach that with their broker?
So that's a great question. First, let's dispel the myth of full coverage. There's no such thing as full coverage. It is something that is a misnomer that people hear and think that that's what they're asking for. But full coverage to one person may be different than full coverage to someone else. So someone tells me they want full coverage. We actually back up a step first and understand what's important to you. Well, I want to be covered for any instance that I can buy insurance. Okay, that's different than I need to have insurance to satisfy the lease that I have for this vehicle, which is different than I need to have the coverage that gets me legal and compliant with the state of Florida so I can register my vehicle. When people use the term full, it also may differ because some carriers may offer a little bit different items of coverage for the policy that may not be available with a different type of policy or with a different carrier. So full coverage, no such thing. You'd start the process, though, understanding what's important to you and what do you need? What is it that you really want? And once we start to understand that, we can start to review the different items that might be of value to you. So to register the vehicle in the state of Florida, you have to have physical damage of $10,000 and personal injury protection. Well, you can get that on most auto policies. Inexpensively, not necessarily. It depends on a number of factors. If you've had insurance, if you your credit, your frequency of accidents and or claims, maybe the duration you haven't carried insurance for a while. So that will all factor in the rate. But people think, well, if I get just a couple of coverage items, if I just buy what's required for the state, it's going to keep my costs down. Not necessarily. There are a lot of those other factors that go into it as well. Well, those get you compliant so you can register your car. That really doesn't cover you appropriately. Then you come into the bodily injury amount. which the state says you're not required to carry if you can provide proof that you can self-insure to a minimum of $10,000 per person or $20,000 per accident. I
That's
don't
very,
remember. Yeah,
that's an interesting point actually, because yeah, somebody once told me, and I believe it was you, that for everything you are not insured, you are now self-insured.
correct.
And what we see a lot of is we see certain insurance carriers, and I think they'd probably be classified as substandard carriers in the business. They are selling policies in volume,
Mm-hmm.
and describing as full coverage simply the minimums to register your vehicle in the state of Florida and comply with the financial responsibility laws.
Correct. But that doesn't really take care of you from protecting your vehicle if something happened to your vehicle. It's not providing you coverage if you break down the side of the road, or the component of potential medical coverage. It's not providing you the most important coverage of uninsured motorist. But maybe that's what someone's thinking. They want to buy every coverage. So again, that full coverage term is really misleading and difficult to get your head around. Now, you're right. What some carriers focus on is when you say you want to be compliant, they're going to sell volumes of policies. They're going to write them as quickly as they can, as cheaply as they can. Sometimes they're going to advertise they don't do a credit check, or they do minimal down payments. They clearly are driving it as a cost type of policy. They want to turn it into that type of transaction where they're just going to write one after another after another. From a business model, I can appreciate the thought behind that as an insurance company, because if you're only insuring this amount of coverage, if there's an accident, there's only this amount of coverage that you would have to pay out, and then you're excused from any further legal proceedings because that's all that the client had purchased. Many of those policies are written by non-standard auto companies or non-standard agencies, and it's all about price, price, price. The funny thing, Chris, is people tend to buy those policies without even looking at honestly protecting themselves or thinking ahead what were to happen if I were in an accident and I actually needed coverage to protect me. So that's in the whole discovery period, talking about what's important to you. You know, what's the value of your vehicle? Is that important? How would you be able to replace it? You drive a nice sports car. Do you really want to forego having comprehensive or collision coverage? But you think, well, it's an older car and I'm not going to get much money on trade-in because it's depreciated. Valid point. It's a conversation worth having.
Well, that's a really good point, because $10,000 being what is required to be compliant, and unfortunately, as you indicated, people that they're indicating that they need what they need to be compliant, but then they are sold on the bill of goods of full coverage, which is simply compliance. It's sort of a little bit of a bait and switch. But even within the mandatory coverages, the property damage and the personal injury protection, $10,000 in property damage, I mean, is that going to cover a damage or significant damage to a new vehicle these days? I don't think so.
Yeah, how many vehicles can you buy today that cost $10,000 or less? I mean, I challenge you to find it. Since Yugos went by the wayside in the middle of the 90s, I don't see vehicles for less than $10,000, let alone the customization that goes in these vehicles and some of the values. I mean, what's the inexpensive pickup truck on the market? $25,000. You hit that
base model.
Then your insurance says we paid the $10,000, the rest is on you, and that's when they speak with people like you, Chris, to see how to get the remaining balance to make that person whole. The insurance policy is not to help people make money; it's to help them make them whole once again, or as close as possible, when an event happens. That's the whole goal for it. So uncovering what people really need is really essential. Going for cheap, going for full, misnomers that someone's going to throw you a number and they're going to save you X percent or only take 10 minutes. I implore people, spending more than 10 minutes on your insurance when you're getting it set up with your vehicles or reviewing it once a year or even every term, every 6 months, depending on who your insurance carrier is, it's absolutely worth more than 10 minutes. Saving a couple of minutes is not worth finding out you really didn't get what you need to get. Now, What you may desire, Chris, and having coverage for you and your family may be very different than what the next consumer needs. Maybe they don't need the same type of coverage. Maybe they don't even have an auto that they own whatsoever. Now, we're not New York City where you can rely on public transportation readily, but look at the developments in downtown. Look at the expansion of the streetcar. They're putting the Publix down there. There probably are a number of professionals and individuals who live downtown Tampa that really don't have a need for a day-to-day vehicle. So they might not even own it. So do I need to buy auto insurance? Not the same kind of policy that you or I have, Chris, because we actually own our vehicles. So there's a whole different policy type, a non-owned auto policy, which provides some of the coverages, makes a few more available, but doesn't provide all the coverage that someone who has an auto that they own would also be able to have. How would that be uncovered? Through the conversation of what's important to you, because only you can ultimately decide that. We can only help you understand what's available, and then you can decide, yep, I need this. This keeps me up at night. You can address this. That one doesn't really apply, or I'm okay self-insuring for that.
Well, you made an interesting point. You and I are having a conversation about this. I believe it was yesterday. We were preparing for this a little bit. That people often don't know what it is. They don't know what they don't know.
Right.
They think they have an idea of what being compliant would be and what full coverage should be, and they ask for that. But in a perfect example would be a non-owner policy. You explained to me that one of the benefits of having a non-owner policy that people don't even think to consider is the fact that if you divest yourself of ownership in a vehicle, either because the vehicle's been totaled in an accident and you don't have the money to afford to repair it, or the insurance is inadequate, or you find yourself upside down, which happens all too often when people don't buy gap insurance, which is another topic to discuss, that these people find themselves in a position where they have to divest themselves of the vehicle, but doesn't mean they're not going to be driving a vehicle of one kind or another. They could rent a car, they could borrow a friend's car, maybe even on a regular family member can lend them a car. And having that non-owner policy not only protects them in those circumstances, but it also protects them from having a gap in insurance coverage. So explain to us why you want to avoid gaps in coverage. And it's not just auto, it's across the board, isn't it?
It's across all things. A lot of people hear it in health insurance. If you've had a condition and you've had a period of time without insurance, who's to say your ailment didn't develop in that period of time? If you didn't have insurance on your car, who's to say there wasn't something that happened that maybe just didn't come out in that period of time where you have had no insurance? So having no lapse in insurance is critical, especially on the auto side, because it affects the carrier appetite. What I mean by that, some companies are fine with insuring individuals who've had a lapse in coverage. However, it's going to be surcharged and the rate will be higher than someone who has had continuous coverage. Even if you've had coverage with company X and you had a claim, that will be more favorable than someone who says, I haven't had a car for a month, I haven't had auto insurance. Well, once you have a license and once you have the ability to drive, just because you don't have a car doesn't mean you shouldn't be responsible and have insurance. You're right. Chris, what if I came and borrowed your car because you have a nice truck, let's say, and I'm gonna do some moving and gotta go up to Home Depot and get some stuff over the weekend, and they say, hey Chris, can I borrow your truck? And you say, sure. Well, that's great. When I'm borrowing your truck, I get to utilize the coverage that you provide on that truck. And then if you don't have enough, I unfortunately, something happens, an accident happens, I'm not paying attention or what have you, I'm at fault in the accident, your insurance goes first. But what if, Chris, I don't really know you that well, and I don't know what kind of coverage that you carry. I'm relying on Chris DeBerry being responsible and protecting his assets to then bail myself out. By non-owned auto, I am now taking care of that, because if, Chris, your policy is not sufficient limits, then I can go on my own policy. The state of Florida in auto insurance is really, really a scary place. You really can't bank on the other party having appropriate insurance to take care of you if an accident happens, whether they're at fault or whether you're at fault. You can't count on the other person.
No, what is the statistic now as far as drivers that are just driving without an insurance policy at all?
Yeah, so it's really averages between 30 to 35% of drivers in Florida do not carry any insurance at all, and they're only caught if they're pulled over and they're required to prove that they have insurance. So many people get around that by getting insurance, registering their vehicle the other time you would check it, and then canceling the insurance shortly after, going without insurance until they get caught, and then that's where the discovery comes out, and that's where the problems get to be. Licenses get suspended and things like that. And so, yeah, they can 30 to 35% of drivers. Now, of those that have insurance, so let's say the other 2/3 have insurance, at least 25% of those carry the state minimum level of insurance. And we already spoke about it. How much does $10,000 get you if you've got to ride in an ambulance? How far does $10,000 get you if you've got to repair someone else's car or a building you ran into or something like that? We're not even talking scary things like hitting a school bus filled with kids. We're talking about one vehicle with one other person in it. So if you really kind of think about it, about 50% of drivers in Florida do not have or have the absolute lowest amount that's required in the entire United States for their insurance.
And you can see how you're rolling the dice, and it happens all too often. It happened just the other day. I went and met with a lady who she was struck by a vehicle that was exiting off the highway and just collided with her vehicle, rolled her vehicle over. She's lucky she's alive. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, she did not understand. She was an immigrant, and unfortunately, that's a sect of our culture that's taken great advantage of by people with predatory practices. And they sell these policies. They're inadequate. She had no uninsured motorist coverage. She had minimums in every other respect. And interestingly, she didn't have bodily injury liability either. So even if she caused the accident, she would be in serious trouble. But now she's in a position where the other driver has no bodily injury liability. She has no uninsured motorist coverage. She has her PIP, but she went to the ER, and the ER is largely going to eat that.
Drains it right out.
It's going to drain right out. So it's very, very difficult for a person like that. And I have to tell clients, that unless the person has assets to go after, there really is no way to do much unless they're working for someone. I mean, there are some times where you can Juan Zamora asked an interesting question. Hey, Juan, thanks for stopping in. Is it a good idea if you have the policy, if you have a company registered vehicle that you drive? And we've talked about that before, the commercial rider on the private policy, or if you're a small business owner and you have a vehicle that you're going to use for business, a good deal of the time, let's say half the time you're driving for business, half the time for pleasure. Are you going to get a business policy or a personal policy with a business use involved?
So it's a great question, and it's going to really depend on how the employer has the vehicles titled. So if you as the business owner have the vehicles titled in the business name and furnish them either for yourself or for your employees, then it would be written on a commercial auto policy. The advantage to that is it limits the exposure to the business entity, not to the persons who are driving the vehicles. And depending on the type of business, it potentially can connect with the workers' comp policy, which could help out if the accident was caused and it was work related. There can be that coverage that can go beside that commercial auto policy. If I have my vehicle and it's registered to Craig Most, then I would have to, and almost all insurance carriers would require that I insure it personally on a personal auto policy, not a commercial. But as you point out, if you're using it for work, and that's beyond driving to and from work. If you just drive from A to work, B, and then back home, that's not work use, that's commute. And so you wouldn't need to specify to your agent, we need business use. However, if you are an attorney and you're driving to court or you're driving to meet clients and you're frequently on the road and you're using your vehicle as a course of doing business, or you're a sales rep, or you're a contractor that drives to 5 different locations in a day, If it's registered in your personal name, you would want to make sure you have business use on it, so it does contemplate that exposure.
Now, one of the phenomena we run into occasionally, and I tell this to people all the time, are people who personally insure their vehicles. They're usually small business owners, like very small business owners, and they try to take advantage of free advertising by putting signage on their vehicle.
Mhm.
Now, if I were to want to do that, I don't, but if I were to want to do that, I would have to inform my insurance company of that, and they would have to account for that in some sort of business rider, wouldn't they?
You would want to, yes. Anytime you're having a change. So if I had my pickup truck and I didn't have any lettering on it, but then I want to start advertising Most Insurance and put up a large magnet or a sign on it, it would be my responsibility and in my best interest to notify my carrier. Many of the insurance carriers will say, okay, that's fine, and have no issue and document it. Some carriers will say, I really am uncomfortable with signage from that standpoint. We would not permit that, or if we would charge a different fee for it. So always finding out, and each carrier handles it a little bit differently. So the best recommendation of that is ask your agent or the carrier, if you're working with a carrier directly, hey, if I would do this, what would happen? You really don't want to do it with the, hey, I did this, when you can say, hey, I'm thinking about doing this, because you don't want to find out you've already done it and spent the money maybe to wrap the vehicle in these exotic wrappings and all sorts of things that cost a couple grand, to find out the carrier says, okay, not comfortable. If you want it, we'd have to rewrite it as a commercial policy. And oh, by the way, that will have different coverage, that will have different costs associated, et cetera. It could be more, it could be less. But also most of those carriers that would write it commercially would say it's got to be titled as in the business name. So sometimes people trying to find that angle, whether it's coached by their CPA or looking for a write-off, sometimes will have their vehicle in a business name and they'll use it personally for everything. And that's where the carrier has a little bit of challenge to say, well, wait, it's titled as a business, but it's used personally, or it's titled in a person's name, however, it's used in a business. Having the conversation and asking the questions beforehand clear a lot of that up. We have some of our clients with smaller businesses that the vehicle's titled in their personal name. However, they use the vehicle exclusively for business use, whether they have, maybe a pleasure driving vehicle that they use on the weekends or non-work, but they use it exclusively in the business standpoint. Some carriers will say, that's okay. If the individual signs a contract, a very simple contract, leasing the vehicle to the business, then the business has an insurable interest and you can insure it that way. So many of the carriers can work with, hey, I want to do signage, or hey, I own it in my name, but I want the business to use it and insure it. There are many times the carriers have flexibility and they can say, okay, do it this way or this way. Or maybe the carrier will say, no, and that's why you want to talk to an independent agent, because then they can say, well, company X doesn't like that type of business or is uncomfortable with that arrangement, but we've got company Y or company Z that absolutely can do it, and these would be the options on how to do it.
Now, that's all great information, because I mean, it's been a couple of dozen times where I've had people that have found themselves in a situation where they're carrying some kind of commercial signage on their vehicle, that the fact of that is not accounted for with their insurer, and they've actually lost no-fault benefits. In particular, the PIP benefits, weren't available to them. That doesn't always happen, but it's happened at least a couple dozen times over the 21 years or so I've been involved in being an attorney. Now, there's one other kind of coverage I wanted to address with you, and I know that it's not one that you generally write as an agent for a company like Most, or when you're representing the auto carriers, but just wanted to hit on gap insurance, because of obviously you need to have bodily injury liability. You need even more to have uninsured motorists, but you can't have one without the other. Or at least you can't have without bodily injury, because the law doesn't allow you to protect yourself and not other people, it seems, which is not a bad philosophy. But gap insurance seems to be the most wishy-washy type of coverage, the least understood, and the most people talk themselves out of and regret it later on. Probably next to coverage, it's probably the most regretted coverage not to carry. But how does gap work essentially?
So that's a great question, and it really depends on the product you're talking about. So much like the term full coverage, gap coverage can be misleading as well. Is gap coverage the coverage that you purchase to increase the liability above your personal liability before your umbrella would kick in? Well, that's a gap. Is it the value of that new car? You buy a new car and you drive it off the lot, and you know you just paid 30 grand or agreed to pay 30 grand for the car. Well, you know, in 2 months later, the value is already going to be, $20,000. What happens with that gap, and how do you get made whole for that difference of driving off the lot to versus depreciation? So you have that gap. Heck, in health insurance, you have gaps that say, well, I'm going to provide this much coverage, but your copay doesn't kick in until here, and so you have a gap. So the challenge with it is it really helps fill in the space, but how it's done differs based on the type of insurance. Typically, gap insurance is sold by the car dealerships, and people feel kind of hustled. They were having to go through and pay for the floor mats and the maintenance program and all of this, and so it's one of those larger dollar amounts, just like the insurance on the tires. If something happens, you get a blowout in the first year, you get a tire insured and paid for. And I think that's why in the auto standpoint, that gap tends to get lost because it's sold typically by the dealers, and it's just one more cost that $30,000 vehicle you thought you were getting is now $42,500. You're like, what just happened? Your head's swimming. So I can't really answer the question easily, but it is a policy that is used to fill in those spaces. When you're looking at a vehicle policy, you ask the dealership, or you can ask the agency. Our agency doesn't sell a standalone gap policy. However, for insureds with a new vehicle, if there's a lot of concern, there are a few of our carriers that will provide that by endorsement to the auto policy that will help you get that. I think Safeco or Liberty Mutual advertises it as that new car replacement coverage. And that's really what's acting is for the X amount of period of time, you can pay this amount of extra money. And if something were to happen, you get the next model, you can't upgrade from a Dodge Volt to a Dodge Viper, but you'd be able to get a 2021 Viper because you told the 2020 and it's really not available. So some of the carriers will provide that in the auto policy. But again, that gets down to what's important to you. You're buying a vehicle, you're buying a home. Those are large purchases and a large asset, some of the largest assets that anyone will own at any one time. What's important to you, and what are you willing to self-insure? Many of us self-insure a majority of our health insurance right now. Many of us self-insure that gap in the auto coverage, and you just have to decide, are you willing to roll that dice in that $10,000 difference if you pull off the lot and 2 days later you get hit and your vehicle is totaled, and now you're going, well, I have to pay off this much of the loan, and the banks aren't typically going to say, oh, you're good, don't worry about it. So it's absolutely one of those, I wish I would have known more, but it's usually too late when people learn about it.
And that's why people go to insurance agents such as yourself. You're a reputable agent. You tend to want people to have appropriate, adequate, necessary coverage rather than just complying with the minimums that the law may require. We rely upon the legislature to be wise, and often we find that we're disappointed because its wisdom often doesn't account for human nature sufficiently. Right now, there's actually an initiative in the legislature. Senate Bill 54 is attempting to eliminate no-fault benefits in favor of a mandatory bodily injury scheme, but that doesn't prevent that 25% or so of drivers that will not own an auto policy.
Correct.
At all. So the only thing you can really do to protect yourself is make sure that your policy has uninsured motorist coverage and maybe collision and comprehensive, so that you don't have to rely upon the minimums that somebody else may carry. But that's all we have time for tonight. And Craig, as usual, you are a wealth of information, and you present it so clearly, and we really appreciate having you on the show. And thank you so much. And obviously we'll have you on again because it's always a great experience. But thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Chris. I really appreciate all you do for the insureds and your clients, and focusing on education. There's nothing more important than passing on the knowledge that someone may not have known before, because you will leave them better off and give them something to think about so they can make the best decision for them.
Absolutely. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching. And if you found this information useful, smash that like button and feel free to comment, like it, or share it. I'm sure other people would find it very useful, because Craig has very cogently explained the approach you should take to purchasing insurance. And it's a very, very good one. And he hit on a lot of subjects that most people do not even know they didn't know. But now you know, so now you can do something about it. But thank you very much, folks. Thank you for watching another edition of my show. And everybody be safe and have a happy week. And we're going to be coming back next week to discuss surgical alternatives in treatment. And we're going to have a medical provider with us to talk about that. But anyway, Craig, thank you very much for being here. And folks, thank you very much for tuning in.
Thank you. Have a great evening.
You too. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.